anticipating?
Like an hour.
Okay.
Yeah. 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 Super chill. So, so obviously with Weird Christian Twitter, there's a lot of people who are in a process of deconstructing their faith and trying to figure out, and I think the pandemic's kind of spurred on a lot of that because people have had actual time away from their physical like church communities to kind of process. And obviously, my thesis kind of intersects with seasons of deconstruction as well. And so I realized, a lot of people have been reaching out and talking to me, and like, man, I think people's stories are so helpful to make people feel like they're not alone and to feel seen and understood, because I think this is a season that the church isn't really equipped to handle and kind of midwife well. And so a lot of people unnecessarily get really either harmed or just feel like they have to leave the church entirely. So I was like, I don't have any, like, I don't really care about the production value as long as it's like people can hear and all of that. I
Right.
just really wanted to get these stories out to mostly to Weird Christian Twitter, just to kind of help, because I'm like, I feel like I'm hoarding all of
Mhm.
these amazing stories when I'm like, I think all of us have incredible perspectives and things that add some nuance and understanding and help kind of move the process along for people.
Right.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I was wanting to do, is reach out to some people that I know are in this season or have just come through or have been through it and want to share
Right.
and share their experience and are willing to kind of share their experience on Weird Christian Twitter, and just be another piece of the content that we're putting out there to kind of support people's kind of spiritual growth as we're all sort of locked away and trying to figure this stuff out.
Right. And you said it was part of the some research that you're doing too?
Yeah, so so I did my thesis on, and I'm sure we'll get into that, on theomachi, but like wrestling and contending with God. And
Mhm.
there's my thesis advisor was really strongly encouraging me to write a book, to turn it into a book, because of course, even with a thesis, you can barely kind of scratch the surface of what's in the Bible around, wrestling with God, deconstructing your faith. And my thesis really is that God starts that process. So these seasons feel um you can feel very disconnected. They're very unsettling. And often the church sees people in this season like they're doing something wrong or they're walking away from their faith. And actually, I
Right.
believe God is the one that not only starts it, but superintends the process.
Mhm.
And yeah, so I want to write a book on that, because I think there's a part of our evangelical understanding of God that's really missing if we don't understand theomachi, and also the process of kind of throwing all your beliefs on the table and really trying to like whittle, thoughtfully go through them to decide what you actually believe, what you think about it, does it line up with what you're seeing in the world, all of that kind of stuff. So yeah,
Well,
so I
and
want to, yeah.
how timely with what you're, interested in research. I mean, that in a sense couldn't come at a better time. I mean, with what people are going through. So that really dovetails. I remember I saw the interview you did with somebody on Theomic. I don't know.
Yeah, my pastor, Wade, one of my
Yeah.
pastors. Yeah.
Yeah. What was that? When was that?
That was back in September.
Oh,
And I basically begged him, because really my study has always been not just to get a degree. I really don't care about academia in terms of like racking up degrees. This topic has been so important because this has been my whole life, and I've been so misunderstood in the church my entire, like, since I've been an adult life,
mm,
that I was like, I really want to get this out to the churches and really start to initiate a conversation with pastors so that they have a real understanding of how to support people in these seasons. And yeah, so it's a very timely thing. I think the pandemic, has people being locked away, has really given people lots of time to think
yeah.
and time away from all of the other kind of things that reinforce maybe our collective community belief system, and is giving us opportunity to think for ourselves, right? And go, what do I think?
Yeah. Absolutely. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So cool. So there you go. That's what we're doing. And this is Kirk and this is Lisa, and we're going to do this interview and share it with Weird Christian Twitter. And I know Kirk well enough to know that if you guys have questions after this, you guys can reach out to us as well and follow up on that. But I'm just going to ask you some questions because we sort of know each other from Twitter, but we don't really know. Like, I don't even know your wife's name. Like that's weird. I feel really close with this dude, and I'm like, I don't know, Mrs. Kirk. Like,
Well, somebody called her that the other day, and I joked with her. I said, I think I've got a new nickname for you, suggested by somebody. And so, yeah, I think the other day when I put a picture of her up, that was like, I think it's the first time anybody's ever seen that she actually exists. So
there is a Mrs. Kirk out there. What is Mrs. Kirk's actual name?
her actual name is Valerie.
Valerie.
Yeah.
Good name.
Yeah.
That's good. And how many kids do you have, Kirk?
4 kids. The 2 oldest are both married. John is married to Aaron, and they've got our first grandchild, Esther, who turned 1 recently, and then they've got another one on the way, coming in about a month. So we're excited about that. And they live pretty close to us. And then my older daughter is Abby. She's a nurse, and her husband, Randall, they live close also, and they have our second grandchild, Jane, who's turning 1 tomorrow. No, 2 days. Sorry, 2 days away. So, yeah. So those are 2 older, and then the 2 younger, Ben and Hannah. Ben is a sophomore in high school, and Hannah is a freshman. So it's kind of fun. We've got the 2 older children, the 2 younger, and then the 2 almost 3 grandchildren. So we've kind of got the whole age range,
all the generations
taken care of, right? So it's fun. We enjoyed it. So.
That's fun. Yeah, it's really fun. I love when my sister and brother started having kids and stuff, and they're just like, so there's a whole other level of fun that exists that you just didn't even know did, right? When you're busy raising them yourself.
Right. And I tell you, everything they say about grandparenting is absolutely true. People joke that if they knew how much fun it was, they would just skip kids, gone right to grandkids, and I can already tell it is a blast. We love it. So it's a real blessing.
I feel that describes auntying to me. So my siblings have always been really, well, my sister and her husband early on made a decision they wanted to invite me into the parenting because they recognized that at some point, as great a relationship what you have with your kids, they're not going to talk to you about everything, but they're like, we want to make sure we have somebody set up that these kids have a really strong connection with, that they can, have those conversations and we can trust what's being said and know that our kids are. So I love it. It's been such a fun kind of journey to be an aunt. It's like the best gig ever. I'm like the favorite, and just the best.
Yes, you can have all the fun and much less responsibility than a parent. I mean, who wouldn't love that?
Right? I definitely do, because I hate responsibility. So okay, so we're going to start here. So I gave you the questions ahead of time, and we'll just kind of go wherever we go. I'm just so interested to hear about like your journey and stuff like that. It feels like in, some of the conversations we've had, is this a newer kind of season for you, or have you been in here for a while?
No, it is. It's definitely newer, probably within the last year, probably 6 months. So it's interesting being on the, early end of it, and yet being able to interact with people who've been in the season a lot longer. So in that sense, I feel a little bit blessed because there's ones who've gone before, and not that anybody's got it totally figured out, but it's nice to be able to reflect with them together and kind of hear even just that validation that others are in a very similar place. So
Yeah, it's awesome. What started it? Like, first of all, let's go. What's your church background? Like, where are you an evangelical? Because we do have quite a mixture on Weird Christian Twitter, right?
Right. Yeah, I've been a part of church as long as I can remember. My parents went to a Baptist church here in town, and that's where I had my conversion experience, if you will. And shortly after that, they moved to a different church in town, and that one I've been a part of in some form or fashion for the last 4 years. And so started attending there, and it was kind of funny. They wanted to go there because it was a smaller church, and now it's probably one of the biggest ones in the town. So the way things go. So I got really involved there in the youth group. I was the kind of kid who just enjoyed being at church and being part of the Sunday morning and the Wednesday night and whatever they had. So got real involved in that, and then went to college at a evangelical school, Biola University, down in Southern
Oh,
California,
yep.
and that's where I met my wife. So
Valerie, not
yes,
Mrs. Kirk. Yep.
that's right. That's right. Either, but Valerie's probably the preferable. Um, so yeah, I went down there, and I went down there with the intention of going into ministry. That was kind of a heart that I had coming out of high school, that I wanted to get into church ministry, and so went there with that purpose. I wasn't a Bible major. People said, find something besides Bible because you're going to study it so much. So I went as a sociology major, and in fact, that's how I met my wife. We happened to be in the same class together. So it's wonderful providential workings of God in that. And then, yeah, when I graduated from there, um, came back to the church that I had grown up in, and spent about 5 years as a junior high and then college pastor. And I really found that as I was doing that, the teaching portion was what I really enjoyed. And I would have never guessed that. I mean, if you would have talked to me in high school and said, you're going to be a high school teacher one day, I would have said, absolutely not. I was one of those who hated giving speeches and doing all that. But the Lord worked. And like I said, the teaching was something I really enjoyed. And so we had a chance to go to a reunion at the Christian school my wife had gone to. I think this was in July, and we talked to the administrator there, who was one of her former teachers, and we just kind of casually threw out that, I might be interested in getting into teaching one day and just want to put a bug in his ear. Well, about 3 weeks later, he calls me and says, hey, we've got an opening for a math teacher this fall. And so here it is, like end of July. We had just bought a house, and yet I could just really tell that the Lord was opening the door to do this. And so we said yes, and moved. And so that's how I kind of got into teaching, but it was at a Christian school. It was not really affiliated with the church. It was kind of a community based Christian school. So it was really neat because I got exposure to just about every background. I mean, we had Presbyterians and Reformed Episcopal and Baptist, and I thought that was really neat for the kids too at the school to get that sort of a broad perspective. So started teaching there, spent about 5 years there, and then got a chance to come back to my hometown to teach at the school that was affiliated with the church that I had gone to. So again, everything kind of comes back to there, and then spent about close to 20 years teaching in Christian school environment. And then these last few have been in the public school. I just really felt the Lord was kind of moving me in that direction. But as far as church background, really had some great opportunities to be involved with some different churches too. Went to Calvary Chapel for a few years. Went to a Reformed church for a couple as well. So it's been kind of neat to kind of dip my toe into a lot of different traditions, over the years, and at least be able to appreciate. But yeah, basically a very much evangelical upbringing. I know all the names. I know all the conferences. I know all the highlights or lowlights, whatever they might be.
It's a lot of lowlights these days.
Yeah. If we talk about Jesus, John Wayne later, that'll come up. But one of the things I thought was really interesting as I look back is that whether it was at church or at the Christian schools, I always had a chance to be involved in some different short-term missions trips. In high school, we went down to Mexico City with a group. When I was in college, got to go to South Africa. We took a group of students at the first school I taught at to Ireland. And then most recently went with a group to the Dominican Republic. And I always felt that, and I didn't see it at the time, but that God was really planting some seeds, because when you get into a whole different environment, not just culturally, but into some very different church traditions, you start to see, wow, this is not the way we do it at home. And again, as I look back, I think that was a way that God was planting some seeds of just, this will take root and grow later. But I always felt like that was a way that my faith was a little bit challenged, just to look at things a little bit differently. I know I was always the type that as I grew up, I always liked things very well defined. If you could give me a a system. You could give me, 5 steps to something. Uh, Black and white was very comfortable, was very safe. So I think between the combination of my personality and just the environments I grew up in, uh, that was really kind of a hallmark that I'd always had, throughout my life. And I mean, there's comfort, there's safety in that. Um, but I would say in the last year, that's really changed a lot. But up till then, you without being, I don't know, overly proud or arrogant, you kind of feel like, okay, we've got things figured out, and this is the way church should be done, and this is how people ought to think about things. And if they don't, well, maybe they'll come around eventually. So it was that was kind of the system that that I've grown up in, and I appreciate it. I don't look back with regrets or anything like that. I mean, the people, as I look back and I see the people that really spoke into my life, that spent time with me, I wouldn't trade those people for anything. And again, just to see how they invested so much in me, the time and the prayers and encouragement, really is, I think, a big part of who I am today. So yeah, so that's kind of my church background.
Okay. What kind of started, so you said like 6 months-ish, this kind of kicked off. What started it for you?
Well, like a lot of people, 2020 was a little bit of a different year than I had expected going into it.
It was?
Yeah. And really, and I even think too, I would say even being in the public schools for the last 3 years, I really think that was kind of a beginning of the process, sort of a way that God started to put me in some different places, with, again, away from a Christian environment where everybody pretty much believed the same thing. And, to get into the public schools and as I said, to be with students who look like the community that I live in was interesting, and it was challenging to me. And I started to really develop some good relationships with people. And I think one of the best compliments I would get is I would have other teachers come in and talk with me, and they would say, "So, so you're a Christian, but you're not like," and I knew what they were trying to say is like, I didn't fit the mold of what they thought of. And that was always kind of a great compliment uh, that they would have these conversations. And I started to have these incredible conversations with people about topics that I would have never known about had I not really entered in and said, what do you think about this, or where are you at with this? And so that, I think, kind of was the groundwork. But yeah, when 2020 hit, I think the George Floyd thing was probably the real kickoff for me. And I don't know what it was. I think a lot of people felt this too. There was just something about that incident that really stirred up in me, having to look at my own perspectives on racial issues, having to have to confront some things that probably I had believed, maybe not externally, but internally. And so I really made it a point that I wanted to start to learn and to hear from people, not here's what white people think about racism, here's what white people think about what's going on with the Black community, but I want to really hear, people of color. I want to hear their voices. And so I started to look for books. I started to watch movies. I started to do all sorts of different things, and I just wanted to listen and learn. And so this was back in the days when I was on Facebook. And it was
Oh,
really interesting because I would read a book and I'd get real excited about it. I'd post something, on Facebook. Oh, I just read this book. This was really interesting. And
oh,
pre-
you noob. Come on.
pre- well, no, it was. I thought. I mean, do people want to engage and learn? But I'd post something about my family or about something we were doing, and everybody's commenting. Oh, that's great, blah blah. And then you put something down that really challenges what people think racially. And again, it was just striking how very little feedback there would be, or if there was, it was very guarded. It was
Yeah.
very suspicious. And once in a while, and I thought this was really interesting, there would be somebody who I had no idea would either publicly or privately message and say, I've been kind of thinking about some of those things too, but I didn't know that there was anybody else who was grappling with that. And it was kind of interesting to make these connections. And so So seeing the George Floyd thing, and just, I think to me, it was almost the silence. Or when I would hear church responses, it was very generic, like, we're all one race and all lives matter. And then that was it.
Yeah.
That there was no, it was like, okay, can we just set that aside and move on? And I just thought, gosh, this doesn't seem like we've really, dealt with it. Or there were some voices that you could tell were, um, not wanting to challenge the status quo. And I would start to get feedback from those people, and it became really uncomfortable. And I'm not at all a conflict oriented person. And I thought, I don't want to get into these big, long exchanges and engagements, through Facebook. Um, so that kind of started me really down a path of, I want to listen to some other voices. And then I think from there, as the whole COVID thing took root, and really to see the difference between even just how it was treated in the school system I was in versus the church community.
Hmm.
And I'll never forget, when we first got our mask mandate, when that finally became a thing, the school I teach at, which is a public school, the signs up at the front of the building said, protect others, wear a mask, which makes perfect sense. And I would go to the school where my kids are at, where I used to teach, the Christian school, and the signs were, because of the governor's mandate, wear a mask. I thought, wow, what a difference.
Yeah.
Tone. I mean, yeah, you're asking the same thing, but I thought, am I am I seeing a more loving others approach at the public school than I am at the church and the Christian school? And just watching how people responded, I mean, I think the general tenor with people who I'd grown up with was, you know, my rights are being infringed upon, and I'm going to resist what the government's saying. When I was thinking, well, it doesn't seem unreasonable to me. Like, let's focus on the wine, not on the wineskins.
Right.
We don't have to be so
Mm.
enamored with particular models. Let's be creative. And so then there was that, and then I think just even the whole election season, as that came to a head. And I tried to pretty much for the last several years kind of disassociate myself from some of the more extreme elements in the Republican Party. In fact, I got out of the party years ago, and just to see all that come to a head, was really just disappointing. I remember reading the statistic that I think back in 2016, 80% of evangelicals supported Trump, and I thought, I'm really interested to see what will happen this year. And once again, it was 80%.
Yeah.
And I think that the church that I have been a part of is probably a very typical evangelical church. And so it really became difficult for me to feel connected in that environment. So I mean, so you take the George Floyd and the silence from that, and then the COVID, the resistance to it, and then the election, and it was just each each one of those events kind of made me kind of separate myself more and more. And I guess we've all had a little bit of an excuse because of COVID. We've been distant. And I mean, when
Yeah.
the church opened up, I went a few times. I just didn't really feel comfortable with that environment. Um, and so, yeah, so I think those were the things that really kind of got me going down this path. And then God bless Weird Christian Twitter, because I really think had I not found, uh, found everybody on Twitter, I don't know that I would have been able to find a group of people to process with. Uh,
Yeah.
there is a church in town that I've gotten into the pastor, and he's been just a dear friend, and so really connected with him in a small group there. But I think it would have been much more difficult for me on my own, and I think, knowing myself, I probably would have entertained some of these questions, some of these doubts, some of these thoughts, and then, well, I guess I'll just go back to what I did before and kind of suck it up and, get back on with, the normal path. But it was, that was for me, was just at the right time, the right group. And I think I started getting involved, probably late October, early November. And that to me was very clarifying, because yes, there are people who are in the same place. Nobody's got it figured out, but it just became a place to really hear those voices, to feel safe. I think
Mhm.
wrestling with things that I had maybe never wrestled with before, never wanted to, or just never felt comfortable doing that. And that was, yeah, that's what kind of really kicked it in gear. So yeah, I'd say over the last 4 months has been a very uh, accelerated, time for me to go through this whole deconstruction of faith process.
Yeah. Yeah, weird Christian Twitter, you gotta love it. The funniest is, like, trying to explain it to people.
Yeah,
Like, so they're like, I don't know.
yeah.
Like, what do you
It,
say, right? Because
I
I
mean,
was somebody that poo-pooed social media relationships, right? Like, I was like, well, if you don't really know them, like, how much of an impact can they actually have? And here I am, like I love it. It's been such a godsend in a really tumultuous year for the world, right?
yeah, absolutely. And I would honestly say, yeah, I probably felt the same way. That I mean, if you had a relationship with somebody in real life and then you interacted in social media, great. If it wasn't somebody you really knew, can you really get to know them? And I've totally done a 180 to where I think some of the really the best and most precious friendships to me are the ones that I've been forming just these last several months. I really feel like in many ways it is the church. I could say that I belong to a local church and tick off all the boxes of, I'm a member and tithe and attend and all that. But as far as really being with the people of God, I mean, that's to me been the place where I have really found that. It's like a Yeah, it's like a small group that just meets all the time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's just, and you just kind of jump in and jump out, and just having that kind of connection with people, which we talk about. I mean, that's what community is in a lot of ways. Is it's just living life together, no matter where you're at, what you're doing. And I've been part of a zillion small groups and things, and it's typically we'll meet every 2 weeks, and then you miss 1 week, and it's a month between, and feels very almost kind of uh, it doesn't feel organic. It just feels kind of forced, and over time you get to know people, but very different experience than what we've been able to
Well,
enjoy.
and it accelerates that intimacy too. And I'm like always careful too, because I mean, we actually don't know each other in real life too, though. So there's always this like, okay, what is this, right? And I think there's been a lot of people trying to define it, and in that a lot, a group of people I think maybe kind of like not thrilled with it and trying to break it apart, right? Because they couldn't quite figure it out as well. But it really accelerates that sense of intimacy. Like if we were back in the old days, right? And you did live every single day in a really small community, right? Where people saw like the full arc of who you are and the reality of how you live your life, and could call you on things. And there was a lot of safety to kind of to do that, right? And I
Yeah,
think that's what it's thrown me quite off, like to because I wasn't prepared for that
yeah,
from social media, because Facebook really was my only other experience, because I had a Twitter account but couldn't figure out how to use it and didn't really dig it, didn't figure didn't understand it. And it really was with the pandemic for me, like in March, where I was like, well, I'm stuck, so I've got to like branch out here and try to figure something out. And in the midst of that, I've been like, oh my goodness, like I don't know if everybody's experience with Twitter is what the collective WCT community has been experiencing, but it's like it is community, right? It is church, right? Like there's, we've fundraised to help people, right? We've, been with people when parents have died and, they've been sick. And I don't know, I think that's a really sweet experience that frankly I haven't really had in my own churches, like physical churches, because it's hard in the busyness of life. And I think that's also one of the serendipitous blessings of the pandemic is we all had to slow down, and all that was left to fill us was actually like connection and build relationship. And I think everybody kind of realized, oh, even us introverts, like I actually do miss people and I need that kind of connection to feel okay with life.
yeah. Well, and I think one of to me, the whole beauty of it is that it is unstructured. It's just organic, And I tell you what, I've lived through every possible program and organized ministry. And
Have you just walked across the room, Kirk?
yeah, and it just, I mean, and to be with something that is just so natural, and I hope it never gets organized. I hope it's always hard to figure out, that it just is what it is. And I think that is the beauty of it, that you can just have connections with people with no expectations, with no, in a sense, rules. It's just, here's people that love God, they love other people, and they love life, and that's it. And you know, I'll tell you, there have been people who have spoken into my life uh, in authoritative ways that I have been so blessed by. I've had people really confront me with things, and yet they've been the most loving
Mm,
confrontations, and I love those people more. And it's like all the things that I had really in my heart desired and hoped for in a church community actually happening. And that's
yes.
what's so amazing. You know, it's like all the formal programs and things were designed to do certain things, and they really never came through because they were so, whatever, you know, hierarchical or expectations. But this is just, yeah, this is just people who are going through life together, and it's beautiful. And I hope it never gets organized. I hope the day that it starts to get organized and structured is the day that it will start to die, and may that never happen.
Well,
So,
knowing most of WCT, we're not that organized of a group. So we're definitely not organized religion at all. So
right.
I think we're probably safe in that respect.
Yes, absolutely.
Um, okay. Is there an image or a story that describes your relationship with God? Maybe pre this season and then post. Is there like what who's God to you? Like what how do you view him in the
Yeah.
last 6 months versus maybe how you understood him before?
I thought about that, and there was a Sunday, I don't know, maybe a month or two ago, and I've been enjoying different online services, you know, just here and there, different people, and that's been really fun to be part of some different traditions. But I remember one particular Sunday, I I say attended, but you know, watched a couple different online services, and both of them did communion. And by the way, just quick shout out to all the pastors who are doing those. Tell people ahead of time you're doing communion, because I don't know how many times I've had to scramble into the kitchen and just grab what I could find. I've had some of the craziest communion
The
elements.
blood of Jesus has been Coke, ginger ale, cranberry, like
Yes, you
gin and
name
tonic.
it. So, but so this particular Sunday, both of them did communion, and the first one was the type that I've been very accustomed to in my life, and it was, before you take the elements, you need to take some time,
Mhm.
reflect on your life, what sin is there you need to confess, get right with God before you do that. And that's what I've always been very used to. And to me, that really kind of symbolizes the way that I've looked at God, because I really think I have a very strong works righteousness sense in
Mm,
me, that, you know, God always has this kind of blank look, and if I do the good things, he smiles. If I don't do, he's not so happy. And I'll say, oh, that's not true. God is loving, God is gracious, God is this. And then I'll just go right back into that mentality. And so the first service that day, that's what it was. And of course, who can think through in 2 minutes, you know, okay, how far back do I go with these confessions? Did I get everything? Do I just stick with today or what I can remember? Do I throw in the generic? Okay. And everything else I did. And it's very, I don't want to say defeating, but when you take the elements after that, it just feels like, okay, I just kind of did my duty, and I hope I did it right. And that's
right.
kind of, you know, what I've always kind of grown up in, a very works oriented um, sort of a system. And then the second one I did that morning, the pastor got up and he said, okay, we're going to do communion now, and just come as you are. You don't
Mm,
have to do anything. Just take it. And it was so refreshing. It was like, wow, that was just that's the kind of relationship I want to have, where there's no works involved. It is just purely receiving the grace of God, not going through some sort of system, some sort of rules, some sort of structure. And it was just night and day to me. And so I left those two that morning thinking, okay, the first one was what I've always been in. The second one is what I want to be in.
Right.
And that's to me what really kind of symbolizes where I've been. Because, I mean, again, the works part of it can be it can be very safe. It can be it's defined and structured, and somebody else kind of sets the ground rules. And if I just do the right things, great. Um, so there's
And
safety.
there's a sense of control too, right? Like you have
Yeah.
some control over the outcome and whether you win or lose, right?
Right, right, and very black and white, and again, and whether it's, I think it's a combination of my upbringing and personality that, made that kind of safe. But then the other is very, it's not as safe. It's a little more murky. It's a little more gray, but yet it's a beautiful place to be. The more I get into those mystery, spaces, the more I love them. And
Yeah.
so that's where I'm hoping that I'm going to continue to travel, in that direction. So yeah, to me, that just has really stuck with me since that day, just really kind of, again, symbolizing where I've been and where I've always wanted to be.
Yeah.
I've never been aware of that, but just not being able to really experience that. Um,
Yeah.
was kind of that nagging sense of guilt, like, well, you don't want to branch out too far into weird areas. You really need to get back to where it's safe. Quote,
Yeah,
safe.
that's like, so it's funny because you just touched on, I think, a really common element of processing through like deconstruction and stuff is that like it starts out with a, I don't know what I believe and I want clear cut answers. And the truth is he doesn't give them. Like it's the most infuriating. Like when you look back and you're like, how am I okay with this? I got like none of those things answered. I
Mhm.
settled nowhere further than I was before. But yeah, I think it really is like stepping into the mysteriousness of God and the otherness of him and really reconciling and wrestling with the fact that he can't be like when you were talking about the programs, right? And how you've tried all. Well, most of the time, those programs started organically and became this big thing. And then we love to package it up and go, if you just like use all of the pieces in this box, you're going to have exactly the same experience. And that's not God. That is not how the Holy Spirit works, right? And yet we continue to try to manufacture relationship with God, right? And I think a really key element of how God initiates and starts deconstruction is that he makes you start to question, okay, what if I'm not good? What about that? Right? What if
Mhm.
I'm not faithful? Let's look at your life. There's instances where you asked for things and you didn't get them. What do you think about that? And we often attribute that to the work of the enemy, right? He's trying to throw you off, he's making you question. And I believe the enemy absolutely gets in there and messes with things. But I think God uses those situations to bring us to a point where we come to the place where it's like, I don't know who you are and I don't know what to do with you, but I love you and I want to keep following you. And that's enough for me right now. And that's not a very safe place to end up, right? Like the other is a lot safer and a lot more manageable, frankly, easier to explain as well. But I think it's a really like in my studies and interviews throughout my process, that's actually a really key part of this is people going, I actually really dig paradox and mystery right now in a way that I was never raised to really understand that God could be two things at one time that seemed polar opposite. And
Right.
what do you do with that? But I feel like that's a really key element that people have communicated initially, kind of being really like, what's going on? And I feel really discombobulated. My what was right is wrong. But in the end of it, going, I actually have come to a place where I really love that because what kind of God do you want to serve if you can control him? And if you know everything about him, is he actually God? Right.
Yeah, I last year, towards the end of the year, I don't know how I heard about it, but the book called The Sacred Overlap by J.R. Briggs, that has been absolutely amazing because he touches on that. He talks about, how we are so quick to put things in either or categories. There's this circle or there's this circle,
Yeah.
and he says really it's that overlap between that's first of all very messy it's very uncertain, but that's where the beauty is. Like, and for example, he used the idea of evangelism and discipleship. You know how we typically think of this sequential. Okay,
Yes.
you hear the gospel, you get saved, and then you get discipled. And they're these two separate realms. And he pointed the idea that, think about those as overlapping, and both of those things can be going on simultaneously
Yes.
uh, in a person's life. Because we are so quick to think, okay, when were you saved? What was that date? Like there's this one conversion experience. You've got to have that story. And people talk about, I mean, you can look at Peter at probably half a dozen different times in the Gospels. When did Peter really believe? I don't know. I mean, there's a bunch of markers along the way. And rather than try to fit it into a defined program that we, have figured out, it is a lot messier. But when you get into that messiness, when you get into the overlap, there's great beauty in that mystery, and discovering that actually is very freeing. I used to think of that as, that's a dangerous place to be. You don't want to get into gray areas, but frankly, I think there's most of the Christian life that's probably best experienced in those gray, messy overlap areas.
And the truth is, they are dangerous, right? And I think that's why I'm so passionate about this, because the church has a very critical role to play. I call it midwifing, and midwifing this process with people, because they are like, God doesn't play games with us. Like when he says, let's look at whether I'm actually good or not, and whether you believe it or not. Here's what you always thought. Is that actually true? He's not playing a game with you. He's actually asking the question. And he knows that there is a good chance, there is evidence to support that he isn't good. Seen from this side of full revelation, there is evidence, lots of evidence to support that he is not good. He isn't loving. There is no God in control. And he recognizes that. But that intimacy that is developed in the process of wrestling through all of this stuff is worth the risk for him. And I think that's why I think it's so important that churches, fellow believers, pastors, spiritual mentors really understand this, because we punt people out right at the most vulnerable time in their journey and go, I don't know where you're at, and we have no understanding of what's going on here, so you must be wrong. Because we surely understand everything there is to know about God. And there, that season is you're so vulnerable, because it's like, I don't know, I feel like a little raw, like featherless little bird, right? Like I'm like in the elements when I'm like that. Like criticism hurts more. Rejection is just, and you also are super like, what is going on with myself, right? And
Mhm.
there is a danger in the gray, but I believe that's where the most growth happens, right? In our understanding of God, in
Yeah.
our awareness that we don't understand God also.
Right.
And just in that, that's where faith is developed, right? Because I think there's nothing more beautiful than, like, look at Job, right? When he was like in the midst of all of the goriness of his story, he throws up his hands and goes, yet I know my Redeemer lives, right? And I'm like, expressions of faith like that just move me to the core, right? Because I'm like, these are not the people we need to be smacking around, right? Like
Right.
they are as close to getting it as anybody is. Like I
Right.
love it. But it actually is dangerous.
Yeah. Well, and don't you think too that when people start to ask those questions, there's a sense of, okay, you can ask those, you can step out for a little bit,
Yeah,
but not for too long.
yeah,
You need to get drawn back in, and maybe you will come back to some of those places, but to give people the time and space to say, you know what, get out there and explore, and I'm not going to yank you right back in here. The path is not a perfectly straight line. It's weaving and
yeah,
backwards, forwards, and stopped at some point, accelerating, and just to give people the freedom to know that's okay, and to not always feel like they have to be like, kind of, fishing pole, and you're reeling them back in all the time anytime they get too far out. uh, just to give that freedom, and that when you sense that, and I think that's what I'm starting to feel a lot more of, is, it's okay to get out into those places, and not feel like you have to figure it out right away.
yeah,
Take time, and just giving that time, that gift of time to people, and not expecting that, okay, well, you need to get this figured out in the next week, right? well, I don't know. Maybe it's going to be a month. Maybe it's going to be a year. I don't know. But being okay with that. And I think maybe even that some of that kind of relates to even how people come back when they've dealt with trauma, when they've dealt with grief, things like that. I think sometimes we expect them to get back to quote normal so quickly, and that probably isn't going to be the case for most people, and that's okay. That healing and that you know, that healing process is just going to take more time than we're willing to let it. So I always come back to I love the picture of Job's friends when they first show up and how they did it right in the one chapter when they just sat down with him and didn't say anything.
Yeah.
It was like, and I think a lot of us will do that, and then all of a sudden we get antsy, like, okay, now I got to start talking and explaining things.
I'm
And like,
out of it already.
right, so
Yeah.
you did it great for one chapter, and then you screwed it up for the next 20 when you kept talking so much, trying to get it fixed. And if they had just sat and let him ask questions and let him go through that, that may have been the better approach. And that's, I think, what we need more of. We're too quick to skim past that chapter, and not really think about the gift that can be to just give people that space and that time to explore.
Well, and I have like huge compassion for like spiritual mentors. And so even having this awareness and taking this on as an area of ministry and focus for I don't know how long, right? I still find myself getting antsy and worried about the people that I'm leading that step out of what I feel like are the boundaries of where they ought to be,
Mm.
exploring this, right? And worrying that somehow they're not going to be able to come back, right? And I think there's two things often going on in that. There's pride, my own pride gets wrapped in it. I also think we it's destabilizing to my own understanding of God, especially I would say a lot of pastors that I've experienced have never really thought about this. I don't think there's generally been a lot of like really intentional, thoughtful um, space and welcome to exploring and engaging with God in community like this. And
Right.
so this is way outside of their wheelhouse and their comfort zone. And so they start like going, okay, she's saying things. I've had those questions too. Oh my word, am I going to end up like crazy Lisa Congo? If I really go down this, I better just like wrap her knuckles and get her back in line because I don't like how uncomfortable it's making me. And then also, I think there's just the awareness of that awful wonder of God and fear of God that comes with it, where it's like this awareness of, whew, if we just hand them over to Him, what is going to come from that? And there's legitimate concern for them, right? And so I think it's really difficult to mentor and support people in a season like this because
Mm.
it's quite triggering, right? Because we're all trying to figure that none of us have it figured out.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Hmm.
What does deconstruction mean to you? Like that term gets used a lot, right? So I was like, maybe I just need to see how everybody defines this because I feel like it might be the same but different for everybody.
Yeah, to be honest, the first time I heard that, that was like a real scary word, because and this is maybe not the best analogy, but uh, after the George Floyd thing, the thought of defunding the police was like just this big hot button, and people thought, oh, defund means you're going to just get rid of all the law enforcement, and that was it. And I don't know that was necessarily the intent, but
Right.
that word really triggered in people a certain thought, and so for me, that thought of deconstruction was like, oh, that's like, are you going to just knock down every doctrine of the faith and poke holes in historic Christianity and say, see, there was nothing really to it? And now, obviously, that's not what it is. But I think for me, as I've talked with people and thought it through, I use the analogy of a house, that you've lived in your whole life, and at some point, not burning the house down entirely, but stripping away everything except for the foundation and the frame.
Mm,
And
mhm.
now I want to rebuild this, and it may, in some parts, may look the same. I mean, I may put a wall up in the same place it was before. I might not. I might have more rooms. I might have fewer rooms. And so I've kind of said, in my life, the Apostles' Creed, the doctrines that are in there are the non-negotiables. Those things, those are not up for grabs,
Mhm,
but everything else is. And
mhm,
that was a little scary for me to say that, but I felt like there's enough structure that I'm going to hold on to. And so at first it's like, first I have to tear everything down, and that's a painful process to say, well, maybe I wasn't right about this issue, maybe I wasn't right about this one, and just put them all on the table, even things that are hard to do. And I'll tell you one that for me uh, has been really interesting is this whole idea of patriarchy and
mhm,
the role of women in the church. And I've come from a perspective that is very much that way. And throughout my whole Christian life, and I just hate admitting this, I've always looked suspiciously at any woman who's ever been in any authoritative position, and kind of have shut myself off from that for so long and thought, well, this is, what the Bible teaches, and that's the way it's got to be, blah, blah, blah. And several months ago, really saying, I'm going to put that issue on the table. I'm going to, just like back last summer said, I really want to listen to Black voices. I said, I just want to listen to women without judgment, without criticism, without anything like that. And I've got to compliment you, because the interview that you did was one of the first ones where I just said, I just want to listen. And I came away from that going, that was amazing. There was
mm,
so much there that, and I think, how many times in my life have I ignored so many wonderful voices in the church, and to be able just to admit that, okay, that's an area that I want to set aside what I believe before, re-examine it. um, and that one's going to look different in my life. I can tell you that room is not going to look the same as it did before.
oh,
uh,
that's
but and there's a part of me that, if I would have, if you would have said that to me, a year ago, 5 years ago, I would have said, oh, absolutely not. This
yeah.
is the way it is, and that's the way it's got to be. And there's all those other, groups that just haven't figured it out. And so, yeah, so for me, it was, look, the foundations are going to remain. And so, let's take everything down. Let's take everything off the walls. Let's, break everything down, put everything on the table, and just give myself time to see, how is God going to rebuild those things. And some things may look the same, some might look different. So it's not just deconstructing, taking things down, but it's got to start there, because I don't think you can do the remodeling until you're willing to do that. Otherwise, you're just putting, a new coat of paint on something, and it's really the same thing.
Right.
So to me, it's that house analogy. Let's get down to the foundation and the frame, and then put everything on the table, and just to see how it kind of gets rebuilt from there. And that's actually been much more freeing than I thought. At first, it was a little scary to think of that, because again, you spend 40 years developing all of these thoughts,
Right.
not necessarily the theology, but the practice. I think that's what it was, is the application and the practice that you can get so caught up in. And that's, like I said before, about when churches weren't meeting, the whole idea to me of, there's the wine and there's the wineskins, and we sometimes get so enamored with the wineskin that we forget it's really the wine that's important.
Right.
And to be able to say, look, it doesn't have to always be in that container or in that, package. And so that's kind of the thought that's been in my mind. And then also just to realize that this is going to be probably a lengthy process. It's not going to be over in a week or a month. I don't know. Who knows how long it will take, but being okay with that. Because again, depending on where you're coming from, I've spent 40 years in churches and ministries, and so there's a lot to re-examine. But it's been very refreshing to be able to do that, actually. So
That's awesome. Well, oh my goodness, Kirk, that blessed my heart. Thank you.
mhm,
I do think, like, I think that's a great analogy actually, and you touched on something too that I'm realizing we spend a lot of time talking about. You hear a lot more about deconstruction, right? So that tearing down and that breaking down, but actually it's not for the purpose of tearing it all down. Like, not everything we believe is bad or unlovely or harmful, right? There's actually good stuff in there as well. It's ultimately for the purpose of reconstruction and recreation, right? And God kind of clarifying okay, you've got this, but here's what I meant for that, right? And here's how I'm growing, and how long it's going to take. My feeling is that it's we start our journey at that point, right? And it's the rest of our lives, and really kind of taking things back to God and going, I don't know about this now. What do we do with this? Because not that he changes, he's eternal, his truths are eternal, but they really manifest and develop and show themselves very different culturally, and with the, the nuances of what's happening in society, and what he illuminates and awakens us to changes that process as well. So I think it's actually just waking up to the fact that this isn't going to ever end, right? This maybe the whoa, what's going on feelings won't always be there. Like, you get used to going, this is what life is, right? And this is what the rest of our journey is going to be, is walking this with you, going, what is this? And what do you think about this? And I don't know how I feel about this. That intimacy is introduced, right? To be able to talk to him and question him
Right. And
about it.
as we reconstruct too, reconstruct not with, I'm going to put things up as solid as they were before.
Yeah.
I need to put things up with the intent that things could still continue to change. And I think that's what has been the problem, is to get so entrenched in one way of thinking, and just,
Mm.
realizing that, look, the Western or American 20th century version of Christianity is not the best one. It's one of many, whether you look at geographically throughout the world, whether you look historically, whether you look through there's all sorts of wonderful contributions. And I think to take one and to elevate it above the others, which is easy to do, has been a real dangerous thing. And so now to just be very open that whatever I rebuild, I want to hold it loosely. I don't want
Right.
to rebuild and then have that same firm grip on it that I don't want to let go, and have to go through this same process again, but always be open to things, changing as God leads, and hopefully not having to go through as, I don't know, painful or as severe a reconstruction period, uh, at a further point in our life.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think I think for me, I started with, so I mean, I've been on this process now for probably 20 years, right? And that's probably not super encouraging to people that are just starting this off, like, wrap 20 years. But it's what's been an inch, like, if I look at the themes and stuff, it's definitely been, I thought, I was like, okay, I'm going to tear this stuff down to get down to the core essentials. And actually, what I thought was foundational at each level gets further pared down, right? To
Mhm.
where it's really like, I'm anticipating and thinking that at the end of this, it's Jesus, right? That at the core of it is really God, triune God, and Christ as at how he revealed himself, and the ongoing work of the Holy Spirit. That's what's left. And I let him determine how all of this plays out and what matters, and yeah. And that doesn't mean that there's no guiding doctrine or beliefs or whatever. There's still going to be things that remain of that, but my ability to hold on to those has really, really changed, right? And so things that I thought the first start of it were a part of the foundation aren't actually a part of the foundation. And some of those, it's not that they're not important, but they're not issues. They're not hills to die on for me. Like, they're not how I would go, oh, I don't actually think you're a follower of Christ if you don't. Like, that stuff's gotten really, really small. And thankfully, because it's heavy burden actually to carry dogma on you like a big old backpack, right? Like, it's heavy, and it feels um a little like I'm unmoored in a lot of respects, and that can be really troubling. Like, what I'm struggling with right now is my nephew is really struggling with suicidal ideation. And so there's been a number of times where I've been praying for his safety, right? Because he's not in a good space at, like, it's usually at night. And
Mhm.
I feel very um unsettled because I don't know how to trust God, right? Because
Mhm.
I've been in life and death situations, and he chose yes with some and no with others. And so I don't know, like I've gotten so far into this relationship with him that I know that he's wild. Walter Brueggemann calls him wild, unfettered, and free. I
Mhm.
can't control that entity.
Mhm.
He's not always going to give me what I want or what is best for me or the
Mhm.
people that I love, because there's a grander scheme and plan that he's working. And I find that really disturbing, actually, and unsettling. And so that's where he and I are at right now, where it's like, where does trust come in when you choose things that aren't, they may be best for me in terms of the eschatological, like the end perspective, but in
Yeah.
the immediate, this is not the best for me or my family. And
Mhm.
where do you settle with that?
Right.
That's the hard part for me right now.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you that kind of reminds me of my view of prayer has really changed a lot. In fact, especially as I've been praying for more people, that's been a whole interesting journey too. Is just becoming very burdened to pray for people, and that's been such a joy to do that, and I love that. And I've really changed the way I pray, because I think before, and I think even at the beginning when I started this little prayer journal for Weird Christian Twitter, I would put these requests down and I would start to pray through them, like, okay, so God, do this specific thing for this person, do that, where I'm almost like telling him the outcomes that I wanted to have,
Yeah.
and realizing it- that's a very well. First of all, it can kind of come across as a selfish way to pray, but also that, okay, there's a definite answer to each of these, and this is what you need to do. And I've really come full circle to where really what I do is I take these requests, these names, I just lay out these needs, and really I'm just praying. Okay, now God, I'm giving these over to you. I don't know what I'm not going to tell you what you should do, and that's been very freeing to pray, not with this is what you need to do for us, God, because I think that sets you up for disappointment. It sets you up for,
Mhm.
well, why didn't it turn out this way? Now obviously we do want, those who are sick to be healed, and we want positive outcomes, but not to make that the focus of prayer. And that almost lifts that burden, and it becomes like you are just really entering into the life of another person. And God, I just want to be here alongside that person. This is the need they have. We certainly don't have it figured out. We're going to give this over to you. And there's just something more comforting and intimate about that type of prayer than, here's my list, God, here's what you need to do, and hopefully you come through the way we want you to. So
Yeah.
even that kind of, you're giving that control over to God, not sure what he's going to do with it, which feels a little unsettling, but at the same time it's starting to feel much safer, or it's starting to feel much more comforting, because I'm not taking those burdens all on myself, and letting God, you do what, you're the God of the universe. You're probably a little smarter than me, so why don't you take care of this? And go at it from that perspective. So that I don't know if that's specifically tied to going through deconstruction, but I can definitely see a difference in how I've prayed about things now than maybe what I did before.
I think it's all a part of that. Yeah, like it's authentically engaging with God and not in the prescribed and polite ways that we have always, like, we typically, evangelicals for sure, my growing up years, like there was very prescribed. Like, we say that we're not Catholic and we don't have like liturgy and all this stuff. We absolutely do, because we definitely have a very prescribed way of engaging with God. And but thy will and all, like, the buzzwords and the phrases that we use, and it's just going, I'm just going to engage you in this thing in this moment, and you can inform it. You can speak if you want to, you cannot. Actually, giving God permission to not speak has actually been a big part of my journey the last like 6 or 7 months in this kind of season of deconstruction, in terms of like really listening to, we talk a lot about in my church about, we have a whole hearing God seminar, right? And so
Mhm.
we're like, okay, so we're just going to read this passage, and then does God give you a picture or a word or a phrase, right? And like, so just listen and journal. And it's there's a portion of the church who I happen to, know and have affinity with, that are like, I don't ever hear anything. And I'm recognizing how much of the conversation he's like a God puppet and I've been the ventriloquist, right? And I've also got a master's in theology, so I can do it pretty good, right? I can convince the big leagues, right, that this is legitimately a word from God. And yet he doesn't, like, he's not a monkey to perform when I tell him to, right? And so whenever there's this, like, what did God say to you? I don't know, maybe God didn't want to say anything. And people are like, what? Like, they're scandalized. Like, what are you saying? And it's like, I don't think he needs to perform when I ring his bell. And so this year has been, I'm going to read your scripture. You get the first fruits of every day, reading a chapter, going through the Bible, the entire Bible. I've never read it sequentially. It's not actually sequentially, but anyway, as it's like laid out. And I'm just reading a chapter. If you choose to say something, you choose to say something. If you choose to illuminate something, you do it. I am no longer the ventriloquist with the God dummy. You need to back up your end of the conversation. And you know what? He is quiet. He is a man of few words, actually. And that's been actually a really big revelation. Maybe he's more vocal with other people, but he actually doesn't. There's some parts of it that I'm like, feel like he says, already said my thing. You're interacting with it. I'll say more if I need to. And I find that also destabilizing because I'm used to, because when you need an answer and you need this again isn't something that I've ever felt like really talked about in church. Like, you're not doing it wrong if you never or you rarely hear from God. You're not bad at this. And that's a lot of reasons why I wanted to do these interviews, because a lot of, like, as I've been talking with people, they're like, I can't tell you what a revelation it is to go, I might not actually just be bad. And I'm like, you're not bad. You're actually exactly right where you're supposed to be hearing and doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing. And good for you, right? You're jettisoning off all of these prescribed, I'm reading about Saul and David right now, right? So I feel like it's like we're putting on Saul's armor onto everybody, and they're just going, this doesn't work for me. I just need a sling and some rocks. That's all I need. I got this. God's got it. It's not me anyway, right? This is just, this is garnish. It's how he's going to do it that matters anyway. So I don't know. That's I have no idea where we're going. I'm probably the worst interviewer ever, but anyway.
Well, I think that it's interesting when you talk about, reading scripture with expectation, because I think, if you do that, if you look at the Bible as, okay, it's got all the answers and I just need to find them, especially so that I can have everything figured out, you can almost over expect and then read into it what you want to get out of it, rather than, like you say, just letting it speak to you. And what I'm doing this year is I'm just going back through the Gospels, and I don't know how many times I'm going to reread them, but I'm trying to do it intentionally. This is really hard to do if you've been in church for 40 years without looking through the lens of, here's everything I've been taught about Jesus. Here's everything I've been taught about the Gospels. And it's almost like I want to just read it as if I had never read it before, and just take everything at face value, even if it seems weird or doesn't make sense, and just sit with that and say, that's okay, and that's been really refreshing to not always have that theological lens that you've been taught to see things through, because then it becomes more of an academic exercise. And I checked my box, I read my chapter, but now just to go, wow, Jesus did that, that's pretty crazy. And I'm not
Yes.
going to try to figure it out and explain it and put it in a box. I'm just going to let it sit out there and be pretty radical. And like you say, then let God do with it what he wants.
Yes.
And so it's a struggle to be able to try to read that way without going back to, that's right, I remember in the one class what I was taught about this passage and how to see this, just to kind of set all that aside. But that's been very refreshing.
Yeah. I kind of feel like sometimes, just finishing with my master's from seminary and stuff, sometimes you just know too much, right? And I think that's really at the core of how I would describe the intersection of of where I'm at with God is that I've got all of this like theological and biblical knowledge for years through Bible college and seminary. And then I went out, and it's interesting because you had said this kind of started going into the public schools is really what kind of started that process. That's also a very like a common theme for people that God uses to initiate these seasons is getting them outside of what they've always understood, and getting them into a completely, immersed into a culture that doesn't really know God and doesn't come from a preconceived understanding of who he is, and that group think stuff isn't there.
Right.
And so I was a pastor, went into social work, and that's like I was a pastor on Sunday, and on Monday was having lunch with a lady who's a Wiccan witch who was talking to me about her menstruation celebration she'd had on the weekend, and I was like, oh dear Lord, what is going on in my life? This is not going to be like
Yeah.
what is happening here. And I think that so the intersection like between those with where here's what I always thought I understood about God and how he works, and then getting right on the front lines of some of the most horrific, depraved, broken situations and going, this doesn't mesh like at all, and is really making me wonder if God is good, and where do I end up if. And so I've had a few seasons where and I don't think everybody's process leads to necessarily this degree. I tend to be a bit of an overdramatic girl. Not sure anybody be surprised to hear that, but if for me that it's gotten to a couple of times just really desperate, right, where I'm like, I don't know. If I'm not sure I believe in any of this stuff anymore. And I feel like God graciously has actually said, okay, like the door is there, right? I don't know. I'd always been taught once saved, always saved. I don't know where I land on that. I tend to think I don't believe it anymore, because I've been at that place where he was incredibly kind and very gracious, was like, the door is there. What do you want to do? And the thought of I don't know who I am apart from Christ, like that ripping away was just that the thought of doing that was like so excruciatingly painful. I knew that wasn't an option for me. And so it was like, okay, then I need to put my back to the door, face forward, but honestly go, okay, like, I don't know who you are, and I don't like you. I don't think you're good. I don't think you're kind. Don't think you're faithful. But the thought of ripping away from you is so excruciatingly painful. I can't conceptualize that. So clearly you have a lock on me and we're going to walk together. But straight up, I'm not your biggest fan right now. And actually those have been the seasons that have been the most catalytic for ministry even and work. Like just I led a small group for Alpha in one of these seasons, and you're supposed to go around the table the first week and go, so who's Jesus to you, right? Because it's all mostly non-Christians, right? Like, and our table's like, oh, he's like a good dude who had good teachings. I don't know, moral teacher, I don't know, it's kind of why I'm here. And they're like, so Lisa, what about you? And I had a co-leader, right? And I was like, I think Jesus is kind of an asshole. Not a big fan right now, but I'm kind of here for the garlic bread and the lasagna we have every week. My co-leader's like, so she's going through a whoa, freaking out. And yet like 3 out of the 7 non-Christians at that table came to the Lord in that season, right? Like it just really, like there's something really, I wish the church could get this, because this makes it accessible to people who are not believers, who are trying to figure this stuff out, but look at it from the outside going, I don't want to live with all of those rules and all of that litigious, structure, but I still have lots of questions, but I'm not perfect and I don't know how to enter in if I'm not, right? And I think if we had more space to be honest about this, like what space could we create for really broken people to come in and actually honestly explore whether Christianity is something they want for themselves or not?
Right. Well, and how can you do that with an unbeliever if you can't do that with a believer first? Like when you talk about, I wrestled with, once saved, always saved. There's this part of me that, okay, right away triggers, okay, I know the verse because I know this is what I was taught. and I need to reel you back in, instead of going, okay, wrestle and you explore that, and give you the freedom to do that. Um, and be able to do that with fellow believers who are wrestling, and then be able to do the same thing with unbelievers, not to go in with the agenda. Somebody said, they made a great comment. They said, I've always been told I need to bring people to church. And he said, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to take Jesus to people. And I
Mm-hmm.
thought, wow. And to listen to people's stories without that, as soon as you say one of those magic buzzwords, I'm going to tell you what the Bible has to say about that. And I really think that that's a place where we have fallen down so much with the LGBTQ community.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I mean, that's probably the most striking example, is always looking at that issue as, you know, I've got my guns loaded, and as soon as I can, and then we just lose the whole conversation when you've got people who are are people. They have stories, they have lives, and let's
Yeah.
just enter in and find out who they are. And so, yeah, we need to be able to do that with ourselves as believers. Give people the freedom to wrestle, to struggle. Do the same with unbelievers. Give them the freedom to be who they are, without always having this hidden agenda that I want to spring on you as soon as possible, because we feel that urgency that I have to change you now. I have to do this now, and we turn people into these projects instead of these wonderful souls made in the image of God, and
Yeah.
how quickly we can forget that.
Yeah. Well, and just to wrap up, that's like one that's interesting because it's touching on another thing too that I found in this is to we judge the veracity of people's faith a lot on very arbitrary like doctrine things, right? That aren't unimportant, but really like there's actually far more that we can be in fellowship with than we can't, right? And I find that's really what triggers a lot of that, or we feel like we understand where somebody's coming from and whether we can trust their perspective or their faith or their walk with God based on their viewpoints on some very narrow doctrinal kind of issues. And actually that's shifted, that's actually been a big thing that's been deconstructed, and just like frankly a sledgehammer's been taken to it, where it's like, actually, right, it's not my place to determine whether somebody's faith is true or real. Like that, I'm not the Holy Spirit. That's not what my job is, right? And so in this journey, saying to people, like, to create safety means you have permission to explore this. However, you and God determine that that needs to happen, and exploring whatever topics, if that's other religions, like whatever that is, right? There's freedom to do that here. And that if you choose at the end of this to not choose Christ and to walk away, I will still walk with you and be in relationship with you, right? Like there's feels like you're right, that project-based love that we have, like we love people and we walk with them until we decide that, wow, we got to pull the ripcord here, this isn't happening, right? And we just like excise these people out and leave them. And that's where I've been recognizing the people that were really able to walk long term, for them, bless them, like they deserve so many so many thanks for walking, because it's hard and it's scary, but it's really making the commitment to, if I'm going to be a part of your safe community, then you go and explore this, commit to doing this with and not apart. And if you choose legitimately, if you choose not to, my love is not contractual. It's not set on you choosing what I want you to choose, or believing at the end of it what I think you ought to believe. It's not, yeah, it's not obligatory or contractual like that.
Right. Well, anything about, how many people did Jesus interact with that never came to faith? I mean, and to think that we would have, my standard for myself has got to be this 100% success rate. And
Right.
yet that's not even what he modeled, but he just this relentless love for people. And I remember years ago, there was a fad, I don't know how widespread it was, the WWJD, what would Jesus do bracelets. A lot of people make
Yeah.
fun of that, but there's a part of that actually is pretty brilliant, because more and more I just find myself thinking, how can I just go out and do Jesus things today? Whatever
Yeah.
those look, I don't know what those are going to be. They might be just silly, random, things that show love for people just for no other reason than to do that. and not have a grander, agenda or project, but just how can I do those things and really enter into people's lives in an authentic way that shows that, I love you because you're a person,
Right.
because
Yeah.
you have inherent dignity regardless of any, life experiences or choices. All that doesn't matter. You're just a person. And gosh, how easy it is to forget that they are people,
Yeah.
and to see life that way, uh, is just very refreshing to interact, and people will see that. They can tell that there's no agenda there, that wow, you just really are just a kind, loving person. Like, that's like a novel.
Right. Like, would we not have done what Christ wanted us to do if that's like, if we have lived each day loving people well unto the glory of God, right? Like, that's
Yeah.
kind of it, right? Where the Holy Spirit takes that and how he works, and the fruit that he brings to life in that process is entirely his province. It's not mine, right?
Right.
And that kind of frees me up from all of those, getting notches on my religious,
Yeah.
belt, right? So,
Absolutely.
well,
Absolutely.
Kirk, thanks. This was like so good for my soul. It was just good
Yeah.
to actually see your face for the first time, like in person.
Right. We are actually real people, right?
It's true.
But I tell you, the few times that I've had to do Zooms, whatever, with people these last several months on Weird Christian Twitter has been so, it's just, it's been so refreshing and just fills my soul in just a unique way. And it's,
Yeah.
know that there are a lot of people still trying to figure things out and maybe never will, and that's all right. But we're,
Yeah.
we're here together. We're walking this journey and doing the best we can, and having a little fun along the way, but willing to be vulnerable, and be in some of those messy, places, but being there together
Yeah.
is beautiful. So,
Cool. Well, thanks for being my guinea pig and letting me
oh,
try this out on you. I'm
yeah,
sure it's gonna bless
pleasure.
lots of people out there for sure in WCT land. But
Yeah,
yeah.
good.
So I'm just going to stop recording here. Thank you, WCT. And actually, if you guys do have follow-up questions or whatever, so I think the next step is I'm going to post this onto, I'm going to create a YouTube channel, post it on YouTube, and then put the link into, profile that on WCT. And if people have any questions, obviously it's at Kirk McCall 68. Is that right?
6'8". Yep.
Nice.
You got it.
And at Lisa Don Marie Congo. So if you guys have questions, you can seek us out there, and especially like slide into our DMs or whatever if you're in this season and you're feeling a little bit lost. Two people anyway that understand where you're at and can kind of walk with you and make you feel like you're not alone. So, alrighty.